Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out Emily Dickinson. The publication of Emily Dickinson's posthumous work is part of a long and confused history. It begins with Lavinia Dickinson, who inherited all the manuscripts, more than 1,800 verses, letters, and fragments, letter by her sister. Lavinia was no intellectual. Besides being a zealous housekeeper and a virulent gossip, she was a suspicious guardian of Emily's privacy. But though she scarcely understood poetry, she felt the originality of her sister's gift. After Emily's death, Lavinia did everything she could to justify her sister's withdrawal from the world. As a tribute to her memory and the hope of establishing a reputation, she turned for help to her neighbor, Mabel Loomis Todd, who had been close to Emily during the latter part of her life. Miss Todd, wife of an Amherst professor of astronomy, declined to attempt the task alone and enlisted an aid of Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who had been consulted by Emily and who had been fascinated by her extraordinary images and verbal daring. Together, they prepared a selection of some of 115 verses, which were published as poems by Emily Dickinson in 1890. The title page declared that the book was edited by two of her friends, Mabel Loomis Todd, Thomas Wentworth Higginson. In 1891, another 167 verses were selected by the same editors and published as poems, second series. In 1893, both books were republished in one volume. Contrary to popular belief, the publication of Emily Dickinson's poetry was not a failure. There was so much interest that Mrs. Todd decided to present some of Emily Dickinson's prose writings. The more so sincere Emily's correspondence was as sharply characteristic as her verse. The collection entitled Letters of Emily Dickinson, edited by Mabel Loomis Todd in 2 volumes, was published in 1894. It contained almost 100 hitherto unpublished poems, rhymed aphorisms, and scrapes of verse. In 1896, another collection of 176 poems was published as poems, third series, edited by Mabel Loomis Todd alone. All of these volumes were somewhat arbitrarily edited. Emily Dickinson was a way of jotting down on the backs of recipes, insides of envelopes, random sheets, brown paper bags from the grocer, and small pieces of paper bound together in fascicles, several different versions of a stanza, and many different choices of words. Sometimes her manuscripts were so crowded with variants that it was impossible to determine what words she may have preferred. Her editors had ignored her indecisions and decided for her. This gave many of Emily Dickinson's printed verse a false finality. In some cases, the words were misreaded, titles, not the poets, and often misleading, were added, and even rhymes were changed for the sake of smoothness and euphony. While her work was never so flagrantly polished and embellished as Rimsky-Korsakov's alterations of the roughness or Magursky's, nevertheless, all of Emily Dickinson's editors took considerable liberties. In 1894, there was a silence and lapse of 20 years before more of Emily Dickinson's unpublished work appeared. Lavinia quarreled with her neighbors, the Todds, in over a few feet of disputed land adjoining their properties. In 1896, there was a lawsuit which involved unpleasant recriminations and brought to light gossip concerning the relations of Emily's late brother, Austin, and the attractive Miss Todd. As a result of the suit and the scandal, Miss Todd was no longer permitted to publish any of Emily Dickinson's writings, although she remained in possession of many unprinted manuscripts. Upon the death of Lavinia, the estate and all her literary properties went to Emily's niece, Martha Dickinson Bianchi, daughter of Sue and Austin Dickinson. In 1914, a new collection of 103 hitherto unpublished poems appeared in the title The Single Hound, edited by Martha Dickinson Bianchi. After another 15 years, just a few months before the centenary of the poet's death, Martha Dickinson Bianchi and her friend Alfred Lee Hampton edited and published further poems by Emily Dickinson, and tantalizing subtitle withheld from publication by her sister Lavinia. Further Poems was hailed as the most important publishing event of 1929. Although it showed no new aspect of Emily Dickinson's life or genius, it revealed with renewed sharpness and more detailed, delicate contours of her particular world, in spite of faulty punctuation, and dubious transliteration, critics found fresh examples of the poet's private place of grace and profundity long before Archibald MacLeish disturbed academians by insisting that poetry should not mean but be. Emily Dickinson quietly concluded, poetry is not caused, it is. In 1914, the English poet Ralph Hodgson mused that God loves an idle rainbow no less than laboring seas. And sometimes in the early 1860s, Emily was saying, the rainbow never tells me. The gust, the storm are by. Yet she is more convincing than philosophy. Nor was the note of poignant resignation lacking. Had Emily Dickinson never written another love poem, her anguish could have been sensed and summarized in a single quatrain from further poems. I took one draught of life. I'll tell you what I paid. Precisely an existence, that market price, they said. In 1935, 50 years after the poet's death, her niece released another 150 poems and poem fragments. There is no introduction or any explanation of the strange and belated publication. The volume was entitled Unpublished Poems of Emily Dickinson. The poet's balance and intensity and restraint was again disclosed, and it was again evident that there were many mistakes in the editing. One short poem, for example, reproduced correctly in facsimile, was misread and misprinted. Meanwhile, a revised and enlarged edition of the Letters of Emily Dickinson, edited by Mabel Loomis Todd, the family's first editor, had appeared in 1931. Besides new pages which enriched the old and placed them in perspective, the book contains source material of prime value, including some 150 odd verses, gnomic stanzas, and improvisations of rhyme. The reader is constantly arrested by snatching as breathtaking as truth is as old as God, his twin identity, and will endure his long as he, so eternity, and perish on the day that he has borne away, so mansion of the universe, the lifeless deity. As Emily Dickinson's later talks and sing in the same breath, the prose is always breaking into poetry, or rather, prose is the natural completion of her sometimes unnatural prose, passages read like portions of unrhymed stanzas, which are interlarded or interrupted by such verse as, could mortal lips divine the undeveloped freight of a delivered syllable, she would crumble with the weight. For no apparent reason except that the poet hoped to communicate something wonderful, the letter writer breaks off in the midst of a gossipy letter of thanks for some goodies, sweet remembrances, sweet speciality, with the amazing irrelevance. Go slow, my soul, to feed thyself upon his rare approach. Go rapid, lest competing death prevail upon the coach. Go timid, should his testing eye determine these amiss. Go boldly, for thou pay'st the price, redemption for a kiss. In 1937, there appeared the authoritative and first definitive collective poems, which assembled all of these previously brought together by the various editors. It included over 900 poems and was regarded as a landmark of American literature. Madame Bianchi died in 1943, Miss Dodd died in 1932, and she left more than 650 unpublished poems to her daughter Melissa Todd Bingham. These poems, many of them among Emily Dickinson's most provocative, appeared in the somewhat startlingly entitled Bolts of Melody in 1945, with an illuminating preface by Mabel Loomis Todd, who had helped edit them years before her death, and Melissa Todd Bingham. In the same year, Miss Bingham issued Ancestors' Brocades, which told the story of Dickinson's feud and subsequent fracas, authenticated by the full account of Lavinia's suspicious dealings, the resulting confusions, fabrications, frauds, and lawsuits, all of it constituting a record of petty as it was pathetic. In 1950, Gilbert Holland Montague, a New York, purchased Emily Dickinson's poems, letters, and other papers, and presented the priceless manuscript collection to Harvard University. There had been constant complaints concerning the careless edition and interpretation of Dickinson's writings, and an authentic edition was often demanded. Because of the inaccessibility of the manuscripts, scholars were unable to study the originals, learned how garbled and printed versions may have been. There were the great part of her work housed in the Houghton Library. It became easier to decipher the mind and true intention of a distorted creative spirit. The task of sorting, arranging, and editing the papers was assigned to Thomas H. Johnson of Lawrenceville, New Jersey. Besides being an eminent scholar and teacher, Johnson was a skilled researcher who in 1939 discovered and edited the extraordinary poems of the 18th century American metaphysical Edward Taylor. Now that this feud is over and the factions ended, and the possessions in the hand of an impartial custodian, a new text may be forthcoming. Based on a possible chronological order, an exact transcription may bring unity to the scattered parts and reveal the woman's autobiography in the development of the poet's work. It can never be finally determined how much of Emily Dickinson's poetry is a literal transcript or actual experience, how much of it an extension and sublimation of it. In a letter to Colonel Higginson, July 1862, she declared that I state myself as a representative of the verse. It does not mean me, but a supposed person. There were it seems, two people at work on the verses which Emily Dickinson wrote and put away, the quietly suffering woman outliving a crippling disappointment, and the supposed person who dramatized her defeat. The Bewitched Personage, 1950, William Stanley Braithwaite wrote, Emily is the proof positive of what we call necessary experience pales to insignificance when placed in contrast to inner knowledge. She was a spirit that emerged independent of the material event. Emily's soul was forever innocent, forever completely knowing. Braithwaite was writing about Emily Bronte, but the sentences apply with equally aptness to Emily Dickinson. Nowhere in literature has institution that inner knowledge so radiantly transcended the fact and surrounded the experience with a beauty which, surpassing the event, makes it immortal. Immortality is achieved in Emily Dickinson's contradiction of styles, in her unique blend of reticence and flamboyance. She startled her contemporaries and fascinated her followers 2 generations later with a sharp poetic idiom that was an unrecognizable rebuke to the loose rhetoric of her period. Her images flash with a true brilliance, not with superficial glitter. Her metaphors, which at reading first seem extravagant and are surprisingly exact. Surprise was her natural language, influenced by the American poet she most admired, Ralph Waldo Emerson. She too learned to mount to paradise by the stairway of surprise. She wrote sometimes under a tragic cloud, sometimes under a dancing star, sometimes as a bereaved woman, sometimes as a happy, irresponsible child. Often, indeed, her writing is too coy for comfort. There is, at times, an embarrassing affection, a willful naivety, as though she were determined to be not only a child, but a spoiled child, a child who patronizes the universe and is arch with its creator. But the pertness suddenly turns to pure perception, and the teasing is forgotten in an almost frightening revelation. Emily Dickinson's way of writing a poem is baffling to the teacher of strict forms. Her poems are not built in a mathematical formula, but on a pattern which resembles that of a kaleidoscope. The verses shift from design to design, from one unexpected arrangement of words to another. No one effect is fixed for long. Everything changes, dissolves, and reassembles. Almost any 8 lines disclose the waywardness of her figures, the playfulness of her speech, and the contradictions of her tone and technique. Her stanzas are composed of curious simplicities and statements followed by swift leaps of insight, at once whimsical and full of wonder. Here is a style which is both spontaneous and subtle, delicate but durable. Her themes are few. The instincts of her few first editors were first wrong, although their final judgments were arbitrary. When the poems appeared in print, arranged in 4 convenient categories: love, nature, life, love, nature, time, and eternity, yet within the limitations of her subject matter and entire poetry, confined to short lyrics, the fusion of observation and imagination is so uncanny as to be beyond ordinary consciousness. It is nothing less than magic that can translate a dog's paddling into belated feet, like intermittent plush that can see a train like some cat-like monster, lap the miles and lick the valleys up, that can watch a storm provoke a strange mob of panting trees, and observe evening the house in the west sweep the sky with many colored brooms and leave the shreds behind. Magic it is that condenses tremendous emotional excitement into the phrase like the silver reticence of death, the death stiff stare, and even in a single word, such as the word ascent, in the tense line, the ascent of a coming foot, or the word zero to describe the feeling of horror at encountering a snake, zero at the bone. Hers is a new poetic vocabulary, dazzling and audacious, in which the homely and the highly imaginative are joined. Noon is the parlor of the day, frost is the blonde assassin, music is the silver strife, and clouds are listless elephants, shadows hold their breath, gentle women have dimity convictions, and the lightning skips like mice. Of every page, the reader understands the pleasure of the writer. He cannot help but share the delight of which Emily Dickinson manipulated her alternately rich and lean phrases, paired her suspended rhymes, and muted her wry dissonances. Her mind, like an idiom, was so much of her own that there is nothing in literature quite like her unpredictable twists of thought, her rapid juxtapositions of the trivial and tremendous, and her trick of changing cryptic non sequiturs into crystal epigrams. There is no way of measuring her ridge or her depth. She is inexhaustible and inimitable. Here then are the songs of one who transmuted the simple lyrics into a medium of tremendous power of communication, one who lived in solitude and silence and became the greatest woman poet ever to write in any language. Thus ends the introduction to the poetry of Emily Dickinson, and we shall try to read a few of her poems in the next few days. The first series is called Poems of First Series. We pray for peace again in the world and pray for the children. Have a peaceful day.